All right, here we go. Today we have Frank Panessa, one of the two undercover DEA agents responsible for the Pizza Connection trial, where the Mafia had smuggled over $1.6 billion in heroin from Asia to the U.S. Welcome to VladTV.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so you joined the DEA in 1968.
Correct.
What made you want to go into the DEA?
Well, I applied for federal jobs, and at that time, you had to take an exam to be a federal agent, and there were three agencies that you could put down that you would be interested in. So I put down the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Secret Service, and U.S. Customs. And then according to your score, when a job was opened up, the agency would call you and offer you, the position. So in 68, I was interviewed by FBM, but by the time I got there in October of 68, they changed the name to BNDD. And BNDD eventually became DEA, all the predecessor things. So I was a street agent in New York, doing cases primarily on the Italians back then, because we didn't have very much information on who the black violators were, but we knew who all the Italians were. And so most of the groups worked on the Italians. And then in the 70s, we found the connection between the Italians on Pleasant Avenue supplying all the blacks in Harlem with the heroin. And so we started concentrating on the blacks. And that went on for a number of years, and I did undercover work into most of the five families of New York buying heroin. And then we got information that the Sicilians were taking over complete control of heroin importation. And that was at the time in the late 70s when Carmine Galante got out of jail. And he took over the Bonanno crime family. And the first thing he did was make sure that he controlled all the heroin coming into the United States so he could turn the spigot on and off and ask for whatever price he wanted. So we had information that they had set up pizza shops all over the Northeast. And one of the main people was down in Philadelphia, and they had like 20 pizza shops, and that's how the name Pizza Connection came about. So we were lucky in arresting two wise guys in Philadelphia, and we says, "Hey, you have to do the right thing, or you're going to jail." They said, "Well, we're not going to give you anybody in the Bruno family." So I says, "What about the Sicilians?" They says, "Oh, they're not Italian." "Yeah, no problem." So what they did was they went to one of the Sicilians, Alberto Ficalora, and said, "Hey, we know you got cigarette machines in all these pizza shops and restaurants." He had 80 cigarette machines. You know when you used to go into a restaurant and you'd have the machine in the vestibule? Well, he had 80 of them. So they said to him, this guy, Frankie Pagano, Frankie Pizza, is in charge of all the hijacking in Philadelphia. And he just had, they just hijacked a shipment of cigarettes. Would you want to meet him? And so, of course, the Sicilian says, yes, So what they did was we went to a mob restaurant, and the two wise guys sat on either side of me. And when the drinks came out, they served me. When the food came out, they served me. So the Sicilians were looking at this, and they're saying, we know these guys are connected with the Bruno family. This guy must be somebody. And so when they introduced me to the Sicilians, And you hear this, but it's true. They said, he's a friend of ours, which means I'm a made guy. If one of the wise guys would have said, he's a friend of mine, that would mean I'm not made. So right off, they accepted me, and we started talking about cigarettes. So at the time, they were paying $7.10 a carton to buy the cigarettes legitimately. We, as the government, went out and paid $7.10 a carton and sold it to them for $4 a carton and wrote off the $3 and change as an investigative expense. So that went on for a few months. And finally, one day, I have the sad face, and Ficalora says to me, what's wrong? I says, well, I do white powder too. He says, what are you talking about? He says, we control all the white powder. He says, who you buying from? So thank God I was buying from a guy in the Genovese family that we hadn't arrested yet. So I says, I'm getting it from so-and-so. And he says, he buys from us. From now on, you get it from us. So now I have to convince DEA that these people are major people. And I had, I use the term empty suits. And some of the bosses says, no, these guys are meatballs and all that, Finally, I had one of the bosses in DEA in headquarters who knew me as an agent on the street back in the 60s. And he says, what do you need? I says, well, I need this and that. He says, we'll set up a meeting with Rudy Giuliani, who was at that time the assistant U.S. attorney to Ed Meese. And Rudy says, what do you need, Frank? I says, well, I need another identity. And he says, okay, we'll take care of that. So what they did was they asked me what my name was going to be, who's my father's name, who's my mother's name, where I want to be born, what date I want to be born. And sure as hell, if you go to the ledgers in that city, I'm in there, being born on that day. I said I needed a passport in the name of Pagano. And they said, we'll take care of it. Because at that time, when you went over to Europe or to Italy, you had to give your passport when you checked in to the hotel. And they were required to make a copy of it and give it to the questora in that local precinct. So I needed that. And then I said, I need $500,000 in an account. So when they do a D&B on me, in those days they used to do those done in Broad Street, they'd see that I am somebody. And then we had to set up a business. So I set up an import-export company just outside of Philadelphia in Trevose, Pennsylvania. And then what we did was we got Rudy Giuliani to come up with the money that I needed. I needed, almost $1 million if I was going to go into deep cover with the Sicilians. So after I told them I did white powder, I also got a penthouse apartment in Philadelphia. And so they had a place to come to when they wanted to meet me. I was living in Medford, New Jersey at the time with my family. And what I would do is I'd go to the penthouse apartment, park the car downstairs, go up to the apartment. And in those days, they did have call forwarding, but it wasn't for John Q. Public. But we had it. And so I would connect the phone to my house in New Jersey. And it was a phone that only my wife knew to answer, and the kids were told never to answer the phone. And I would go down to the garage, get into a different car, and drive over to Jersey to be with my family. Well, one night I get a call on the phone, and it's the Sicilians. They says, oh, we're downstairs, meaning downstairs in the penthouse, I says, oh, I'm with my kumare, which means my girlfriend. why don't I meet you at a restaurant in about a half hour? And I said, why don't you go over to La Buca restaurant, which was in Philly. And so now I have to get surveillance agents. Could only get one agent. So I go to La Buca, and the Sicilians say, let's go for a ride. So now I'm in the car with 3 Sicilians and only one surveillance agent following us. And as soon as we go around the corner, he's lost. He loses us. So now the Sicilians start talking about, we don't do lightweight stuff, and so I got indignant. I says, hey, I don't even know you. Don't you tell me you don't do any lightweight stuff. So Ficalora wanted the deal to go down. So he says, oh, why don't you buy $85,000 worth of heroin? I says, okay. So now I have to go back and get the money. And it came through. Rudy Giuliani came through with the money. So the first buy I made from the Sicilians was an $80,000 heroin buy. And when they walked away from that, carrying that bag of money, I was in. And from there, it just mushroomed where I continued to buy heroin from them, found out a lot of intelligence about the organization, found out that Galante's bodyguards were the ones that set him up for his murder. And as a reward, Cesare Bonaventure, who was one of his bodyguards, became the head of the heroin distribution in the United States. Now, this one cell that I was involved in were bringing in $1 million a day. People can't believe that. There was an apartment in Brooklyn, and a guy that had the apartment, his name was Rosario Dispenza, and it was his job to collect all the money that came in from all the different people selling the heroin. And literally, he'd bring in almost $1 million a day. And then it was his job to launder it. So he would go to one of the brokerage houses, and he had a guy there, and the guy knew that $100,000 was for him, and he had to launder the $900,000. And what they would do, they'd invest in like Mrs. Fletcher's storm door company. It didn't matter. A month later, they sell the stock. If they made money, fine. If they didn't make it, the money's laundered. And then a check would go, to the Caribbean. And this was before they had all the, all the laws where you had to report any transaction over $10,000 and all that. And again, I was in with them. I would find out about murders that they were doing. We went over to Europe. I told them that I had an import-export company in Germany, and that we could bring the heroin in through the import-export company. Because they used to come down to Trevose, Pennsylvania to see my company, and what we would do, we'd rent trucks, and we had the metal stickums that we put on the side of the trucks that said Prima Import Export, Trevose, Pennsylvania. And so then it was time to go to Germany, and the first time we went over to Italy, I'm waiting for the Sicilians to come over, and they said, no, you have to come back. We can't do anything because we had to kill a judge. And that's when they killed Judge Cinizzi over in Sicily. So the next time we went over, we went to Frankfurt. And I land with the Sicilian, and we go out, and there's this big burly German by a big Mercedes, and he says, Frank, so good to see you, he says. And he says to the Sicilian, see what Frank got me? And now we drive, I've never met this guy before, we drive to a company in Frankfurt, and there it is, Prima Import Export over the door. We go in, there's this young blonde sitting behind the desk, and says, oh, Frank, so good to see you. I made the cookies that you like. And I'm saying these people are professional. They were the BKA. They were professional. So, of course, the office was wired for sound and video. And what we were going to do was bring the heroin over the northern border into Switzerland and then smuggle it out of my company in Frankfurt, Germany. And this went on. And going back to the United States, whenever there was a shipment taken down, they would say, oh, that was our heroin. And if you ever have any problems, we own the Dominican Republic, because they were laundering a lot of money out of the Dominican Republic in the casinos down there. And so he says, whenever you get in trouble, go down there and we'll take care of you. And that's what happened. There was a shipment of heroin that came in tiles to Buffalo, New York, to a guy by the name of Ragusa. And the DEA seized it, and Ragusa escaped, and that's where he went, to the Dominican Republic. But this went on. It was unbelievable. I remember one day I went down into the pizzerias, and on the table are 30 kilos of coke. And he says, oh, take some. I says, well, I don't get involved in that stuff, He says, well, we control the coke, too, in the United States. And so his little son was there, a little 6-year-old. And so I said, in slang, I said, I feel scumbari. I feel itchy with the kid being here. So he says to the kid, Paolo, what do you see? And this little 6-year-old mafioso says, I see nothing. Mafia in training. So it went on. And then finally, the government says, well, we're going to take down. Oh, in the meantime, Steve Hobson, we were selling them tomato sauce, cheese, and all that. And Steve Hobson was into one of the Sicilians, and they followed the Sicilian up to New York to pick up a package for Steve. And that's when they got all the people in Brooklyn. And that's how what we had was we had 7 people in Philadelphia that they arrested, 7 Sicilians, and was prosecuted in Philadelphia. Then you had the people in New York that were prosecuted in the Southern District. And at that time, Rudy Giuliani was then U.S. attorney back there. And Louis Freeh, who then became director of the FBI, he was the prosecuting attorney. And everybody got convicted.
Okay, so from what I understand, originally Carlo Gambino started bringing in the Sicilians to do a lot of his dirty work for him.
Correct.
And these guys started to kind of come over, and they would work with the Italian mafia to do various things for them, and they kind of started to build up their own organization in the U.S. as well, right?
Yes, and that's when they started the pizza shops, not only to have a cover, but as a distribution point for heroin. So Not only were they used to do hits, they ran the pizza shops and they were distributing heroin.
Okay, and while you're working undercover for these 2 years, you had 22 hits happen around you.
Yeah. Well, that was the time after Bruno that Nicky Scarfo was trying to take over the Philadelphia mob. And from 82 to 84, there were 22 Mafia hits, Sal Testa, his son, and a bunch of other people. I remember we used to hang out in an after-hours club in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. It was called Club Enchante, and this is 1983. And you'd have the people from the Bruno mob, you'd have Nicky Scarfo, and then you'd have the Sicilians. And I, of course, was with the Sicilians. And I remember Alberto Ficalora saying to me, you see those 2 guys over there? And he was pointing to the Salina brothers. He says, they show no respect. And he says, we're men of honor, and they're showing no respect. A month later, both brothers were killed. And that's, it didn't matter to them, they had a particular code and they stuck to it. Nicky Scarfo, of course, was a lunatic. He'd kill anybody just to get ahead. So now we're buying heroin from the Sicilians, and they decide they want to take them down, 84, 85. And they said, we're going to get rid of the Sicilian problem. And I said to them, please don't do it. We're getting so much intelligence information from these people. Why take them down? Well, the powers to be wanted to do it. So they say to me, why don't you stiff the Sicilians and see what happens? I says, you have to be kidding me. If I stiff them, they're going to come out and kill me. I owed them, see, they used to give me the heroin on consignment. So I owed them $150,000. And they said, stiff them. So I disappeared. Well, of course, the Sicilians put a contract out on me. And they try to find me every way they could. I used to hang out at a restaurant in Cherry Hill called Sinelli's. And they would say, telephone call for Frank Pagano. And they'd be waiting to see if I went to the phone. The wise guys that introduced me, they says, oh, Frank's going to be at such and such a restaurant in Philadelphia. And sure as hell, there was a van outside the restaurant waiting for me. So now it comes time to arrest them. And the government says, call them up. So I call Paolo Laporta, the main Sicilian, and I said, Paolo, I want to pay you what I owe you. He says, no, that's okay. It's already gone to the collection agency, meaning that the contract was out on me. So the arrests go down, and they find out that I was an undercover agent. And normally, you don't see them until you go to trial. But through their attorney, Laporta wanted to see me. And I says, either he's going to threaten me or I don't know. And so the assistant U.S. attorney said, do you want to go see him? I says, I have no problem with it. So what we did, we took pictures of their houses, their wives, their girlfriends, their kids, and everything. And I brought them with me to the jail. And I figured if he's going to threaten me, I'm going to say, there's 12 copies of these pictures, and there's 12 agents that are going to go after your family and everybody. But it didn't work out that way. When I met him, he says, Frank, ours was a gentleman agreement. He says, it was a brotherly agreement. He says, but the people that introduced you to me, he says, they have to be held accountable. And so we had to put them in the witness protection program,
Okay, so everything is starting to come to a head. And then in April of 1984, the FBI started to close in on the Sicilian Mafia godfather, Gaetano Badalamenti. And this was the top guy in the Sicilian Mafia.
Correct.
Now, I guess in 78, there was somewhat of a war that happened in Sicily, and Badalamenti was actually banished from Sicily, but
yes,
he still continued to run this whole drug operation.
And he went to Brazil.
Okay.
And also at that time, you had Tommaso Buscetta, who then turned to be against the Mafia, and they had the Maxi trials in Sicily where they tried 300 mafioso at once. And I was the go-between between the Italian police and Tommaso. We had him in the witness protection program, and there was only one agent that knew where he was, and he lived next to him. So whenever we wanted Tommaso Buscetta, I would call the agent and we'd meet somewhere. At the time, they were living in Florida, and we would meet like in New Jersey, and I would bring him money from the Italian police because he testified at the trial. And so I remember one time I brought him $100,000 from the Italians to give him, and I paid it to him in New Jersey. And we used to talk, and he told me, he says, I was a man of honor. He says, you never touched a man's family. He says, they killed my son, my brother, my cousins. He says, they're not men of honor anymore. And finally he flipped. And that's when Judge Falcone came into the picture, who was an unbelievable man. Here was a man that was devoted to getting rid of the mafia. And I worked with Giovanni Falcone.
So Gaetano Badalamenti, he actually joined forces with Salvatore Catalano?
Yes.
Who was part of the Bonanno crime family in New York?
In New York and Brooklyn.
Okay. And with this connection, they moved what they say was $1.65 billion in heroin.
Without a doubt.
Which originally from the Middle East was imported into New York and then distributed through the United States.
Well, it was also coming in from Italy and Sicily, because what they were doing in the early 80s, they had a guy working at Alitalia in Milan. And that's, in those days, you could send unaccompanied baggage on a plane. I mean, you can't do that today. And so what they would do is they'd have a suitcase that they'd put heroin in, like 20 kilos, and they'd send it unaccompanied to JFK. Now, they had a baggage handler at Alitalia at JFK. When the baggage came in, he would grab that bag, and that's how they were bringing the heroin in. They were also bringing it in tiles, the pallets of tiles. They were bringing it in tomato cans. They were bringing it in coffee makers and furniture. But a lot of it was still coming from Sicily. But you're right when you say it was Catalano and Badalamenti. And the way we got Badalamenti is we had wiretaps on his nephew out in the Midwest who had a pizza shop. But the nephew was a real dummy. Badalamenti would try to talk to him in code to say, we're going to meet in such and such a place, And the nephew could never figure out what Badalamenti was saying. Finally, Badalamenti spurted, I'll meet you in Madrid. And that's how they grabbed him, in Madrid.
Okay, and his nephew was Pietro Alfano.
Correct.
Who owned a pizzeria in Detroit.
Correct.
So they go and meet up in Madrid. Badalamenti was there with his wife and his son, and the authorities scooped in and arrested them.
Correct.
And then the next day, the FBI hit 30 other mafia members all over the U.S.
Yes. But the thing that I want to bring out, during my undercover activity, once Laporta came to me and he says, look, he says, I need $100,000. He says, could you lend me the $100,000? He says, I'll give you two $50,000 bearer bonds that are getting 13% interest. And so I had to convince the suits in Washington that, hey, he's giving me real bearer bonds, So when it came time for me to give him the bearer bonds back, he said, why don't you keep them? He says, they're getting 13% interest. And when you go to cash them in, we own the guy, the manager of the bank. Okay? So we take one of the $50,000 bearer bonds, bring it to the bank, and he says, it's worth $48,000, meaning he's going to get $2,000, but there's no IRS forms. And but after we arrested the Sicilians, we seized all their records, and we saw that Giovanni Laporta had 5 distributors in Puerto Rico, and we had all the records. So I went down to Puerto Rico, contacted all 5 of them, and said, look, Giovanni was arrested. I know you still owe $20,000. I know he fronted you a half kilo, the other guy. I says, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. To show good faith, next week, I'm going to give the stuff to you at such and such a price. So I'll meet you all next Monday here in Puerto Rico. Well, Monday came and nobody showed up. And so when we eventually arrested them, we said, how come you didn't show up that Monday? Because the day after I met them, the real person that took over for the Sicilians had already contacted them to continue business. So we didn't do anything to the Sicilian Mafia. They were in business the next day.
So everyone gets arrested, and then the trial officially starts on September 30th, 1985.
Yes.
And when the judge started selecting the jurors, he actually selected them anonymously, so their names were secret. So no one was going to potentially get bought off or killed and so forth.
Exactly.
So then the trial officially starts on October 24th, 1985, with 22 total defendants, all of them Sicilian. In New York.
Yeah.
Right. This trial would go on to last 16 months, which is the longest criminal jury trial in U.S. history to this day.
But it ended in convictions.
It did. Okay. But then, around 1 month after the start of the trial, Paul Castellano, who is the boss of the Gambinos, ends up getting killed by John Gotti, yes, with Sammy the Bull involved in it also. And I interviewed Sammy, and we went into the whole details of it.
Yeah.
When that happened, did that set some sort of stigma on the trial with the craziness that was happening outside the trial?
No. It had really nothing to do with the trial. We had solid evidence from wiretaps and Steve Hobson buying the heroin from Catalano and those people in New York, and me buying the heroin from the other Sicilians connected with Cesare Bonaventure and Catalano. So it didn't have any bearing on it. Not that I saw.
Okay, but then by 1987, as the trial is progressing, on February 12th, the cousin of the main Sicilian boss, who we talked about, Pietro Alfano, was walking with his wife carrying groceries in Greenwich Village in New York, and 3 guys show up and actually shoot him in the head.
Yeah, because they were afraid he was going to cooperate. I used to call him Buffono Alfano. He was a buffoon, and so I think they saw that, and they weren't going to take any chances. Because the government was actively trying to flip him, to be an informant.
Okay, and from what I understand, it was a $40,000 hit on him, and 3 men were later arrested for the murder, who I guess were part of the Gambino crime family.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then Pietro Alfano ends up getting killed in the middle of the trial, and at that point, the judge actually sequestered the jury, which meant that he put them in hotel rooms in order to protect them?
Yes.
Okay, so the trial is dragging on, and it's finally coming to its conclusion, and the lawyers are starting to, are trying to defend their clients the best they can, but it's not going very well. And as the jury is starting to deliberate, one of the jurors actually received a threatening phone call and ended up excusing themselves from the trial because they were too scared that they might get killed over being a jury member.
But you had the alternates.
Right.
There, yeah.
Okay. After the jury deliberated, all 19 defendants were convicted. Badalamenti and Catalano both got 45 years. Since Badalamenti was actually extradited from Spain, there was a deal in place that he would actually get a maximum of 30 years. But he ended up dying in prison in 2004 at age 80, which is 13 years before he would have actually gotten out.
Yeah.
You took the stand in the trial?
Excuse me?
Did you take the stand
I
in the
took
trial?
the stand in Philadelphia. See, what they did, they split it up. You know, it was a turf war. Who was going to get all the defendants? So they decided all the deals that I did in Philadelphia, they would try all those people in Philadelphia. Steve Hobson testified in New York. And we were the only undercover agents that actually bought heroin from the Sicilians.
Okay. And from what I understand, this was sort of a very monumental trial for the FBI in terms of working with other agencies, working internationally, setting up departments in other countries, which even to this day, with all the cyber crimes and everything else, like the work from that trial is still being used today.
Yeah. See, you have to understand that at that time, DEA was already in 50 different countries. We had established ourselves back in FBN and BNDD. The FBI then finally was able, with their legats, to go into the different countries. And it worked out real well for them because then they got into the cyber crimes and all that. They did some narcotic cases in Europe, but primarily it was us and customs working overseas, because they sent me over and I was narcotic attaché for 3 years from 88 to 91. And I was chief U.S. advisor to the Italian police agencies on narcotics. And that's when I worked with Giovanni Falcone. And unfortunately, he was murdered with his wife in 91. And he was such a devoted person. The FBI even offered him a job in Washington to be their man on the Mafia, but he just didn't want to leave Italy.
Well, in 1989, undercover DEA agent Everett Hatcher was meeting with a Bonanno Mafia associate, Gus Ferracci.
No, he was meeting with John Gotti's, one of John Gotti's people. Now, Everett Hatcher, I did undercover work for. He was a real gentleman, okay? And so what had happened, he was doing undercover into Ferracci. And from the beginning, Ferracci was going to rip him off. And he shows up with the money and Ferracci kills him, okay? So now we know it's Ferracci and we can't find him. So on an early Sunday morning, the head of DEA in New York goes to Gotti's house, knocks on the door, and he says, "Now, one of your people are going to move. I'm going to have an agent walking side by side of all your people if you don't give up Gus Ferracci," you know. So Gotti must have figured that if he gives up Ferracci, Ferracci's liable to flip. So Gotti's people killed Ferracci.
Right. And there ended up being this national manhunt for Ferracci.
Yeah.
Which they actually made movies out of. The movie Out for Justice with Steven Seagal is actually based on Gus Ferracci's manhunt.
Yeah.
Right. Like in the process of them trying to find Ferracci actually had a mentor in the Mafia with the Bonanno family,
Yes.
a capo named Jerry Chili Sr.
Yeah.
He wanted to kill Ferracci, and he gave the hit to a new mob associate with the Lucchese family named John Petruccelli. Petruccelli actually refused to kill him. And then 2 months later, they found Petruccelli dead with a hood over his head, which is a Sicilian message for never keep secrets from the family.
Yeah.
So it was really kind of a mess, this whole Ferracci Mafia situation.
Yeah. Everett Hatcher was such a nice guy. as I say, I did undercover work for him. Cases that he made, I went undercover. And it was a shame to be taken like that.
Right. And ultimately, they actually found Faraci dead with another guy who had also gotten shot. I guess the way they got shot was similar to the way the Faraci actually killed the DEA agent.
Yeah. Yeah.
And ultimately, they found the three guys. Well, they found two guys that were involved in it, and the third guy was already dead by the time they actually found him. Well, and then in 1985, there was the murder of DEA agent Kiki Camarena, he was actually kidnapped by drug traffickers hired by Mexican politicians.
Yes.
In Mexico.
Yes.
He ended up being interrogated and tortured and ultimately killed.
Yes.
Did you know Kiki at all?
I knew Kiki. I met Kiki, but I didn't work with him. But when he was kidnapped, they brought me into headquarters to work on the desk because we set up a special desk to try to find him. We knew that he was taken. And I must say, every government agency went out of their way to try to find Kiki. I mean, the agency with their satellites, taking pictures of the farm that we thought he might be on. And it was an all-out effort. And finally, when they investigated it, they got to it. And all these years later, they finally got everybody that was involved in it.
Right. And from what I understood, it kind of strained U.S.-Mexican relations over the situation.
Oh, yes. But that's happened so many times. You know, there's so much money to be made.
Right. And just recently, I guess they had actually recaptured one of the drug traffickers involved in that case, Rafael Caro Quintero.
Yes, they did.
Right. He was recaptured in July of this year.
Yeah.
These types of situations where DEA agents get killed and kidnapped and so forth, does it happen very often? I mean, when you're going undercover, you're taking the risk of this happening at any moment.
You know, you have to plan each case. You have to see who you're dealing with. And you have to know everything about them. And if you have a sixth sense, if you feel that something is wrong, you just don't meet with them. And that's how I kept alive, you know, because it would only take one person to tell the Sicilians that I was an agent, and I'd be gone. You know, the same with when I was working on the Colombians. All it would take is and they had the money. They bought judges, they bought cops, you know. So you had to plan ahead. You had to know who you were dealing with. And you sort of had to have like a sixth sense. If something wasn't right, you didn't get involved in it. But I was pretty lucky with the Sicilians for the simple reason I was a cash cow for them. You know, I bought over $1 million worth of heroin from them, so they didn't want anything to happen to me. The Colombians were something else. They'd kill you in a second. And whenever I dealt with the Colombians, you know, I was extra cautious. I remember doing a deal with them. I had an undercover Learjet with 2 DEA agent pilots, and we would fly to Teterboro Airport to a section called Millionaire, and that's where all the private jets came in. And we had a judge in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, who gave us wiretap authorization on 3 cell phones. So when I met the Colombian, we take off from Teterboro and we're flying around, and I says, oh, why don't we land in Harrisburg and have some lunch or something? So we go there, and I'm getting off the plane, and I say to the Colombian, those are 3 new phones, so use any one you want if you have to call your people. And sure as hell he did. And we got a take on where he was calling, you know. But then they wanted to meet me in El Salvador. And in all the countries I've been in, you know, you feel like your life isn't worth a nickel. They'd kill you for a nickel in El Salvador. And so whenever anybody came up to me, they'd say, "Oh, are you American?" And I'd start talking Italian, saying, "No, I'm Italian," you know. But again, with the Sicilians, they were one tough group, millions and millions of dollars. And when you say billions, it's the truth. It's the actual truth. People didn't realize the magnitude of it. If you were to tell people, hey, I was involved in one cell that was bringing in $1 million a day, they'd say, oh, come on. No, it's true. That's how much money they were making.
2 years after you joined the DEA, in 1970, that's when the RICO laws were enacted.
Yes, they were.
And that was really to try to bust the Italian Mafia, right?
It was. And it was very effective.
Well, you fast forward to 2022, RICO has been used all over the place with lots of different groups and so forth.
Of course.
Right now in the hip hop world, one of the biggest cases is there's a crew of rappers and associates in Atlanta, named YSL. Some of the rappers are like Young Thug and Gunna and so forth. 28 of them are now locked up over a state RICO case, involving drugs, murders, gangs, and so forth. Yeah. In this case, hip-hop lyrics are in the indictment, social media posts are in the indictment. Now, this is a state RICO case rather than a federal RICO case. From your understanding, what's the difference between state and federal RICO?
Well, are you talking about Georgia?
Yes.
Did you say? It's fashioned after the federal. So there's very little difference. They legislated it to be like the federal. And it's a heavy law, and if they have them, it's a tough case to beat, a RICO case. It really is.
I mean, when you look at cases like this, in all the years that you've worked on them, RICO is so general that sometimes you get people caught up in these RICO cases that aren't really doing criminal activities themselves. They may know someone, they may be associated with someone, but they themselves are not the ones doing the crimes.
I absolutely agree with you, because I've known people that have been caught up in these RICO cases, and they were just like an associate, but nothing to do with the actual crime. They were arrested because of their close proximity to the person that was doing the crime. No, I do agree with you about that. It's the original intent was great. They made great cases, but then they started diluting things, reaching out here, doing a RICO case on this and that type of thing.
Well, in 2022, fentanyl seems to be the biggest problem in the U.S. Fentanyl is a drug that's been around for a while, but it seems like recently it's almost went to the top in terms of not only distribution, but also the death involved and the overdoses and everything else like that.
Well, I went through the Mafia wars, the heroin scourge. I went through the cocaine cowboys, working on the Colombian cartels. But people have to realize that a narco war is going on right now. Statistics. So far this year, over 111,000 people have died from fentanyl overdoses. God knows how many weren't even reported, okay? Since this year alone, seizures of fentanyl have been over the equivalent of 37 million dosage units. 37 million. And now they're even making the fentanyl, in different colors to attract kids. You have a narco war going on. You have the Mexican cartels with the Chinese doing this to us. People have to wake up. We have to do something about our southern border. And people aren't educated as to the dangers of fentanyl. I'm on the advisory council of the Mob Museum in Las Vegas. And I made a recommendation that they set up a display on fentanyl with handouts for people to educate kids and people as to the dangers of fentanyl. The cartels are having the money they're making from fentanyl, they're having it laundered by the Chinese. The Chinese, our intelligence shows that the Chinese are charging them 1% to launder their money. Normally, if you're in the money laundering business, it's about 6%. So they're only charging them 1%, selling them all this fentanyl, coming over the southern border. I mean, we have to realize something has to be done. Just those statistics alone, over 110,000 documented deaths this year. I mean, something has to be done. I mean, that's my opinion, Frank Panessa's opinion, but it should be the opinion of many people that something should be done.
Well, at one point, we talked about how you had a $150,000 hit on you.
Yeah.
Since then, you've helped lock up 2 major mafia bosses and involved in lots of other deals involving some pretty scary individuals from Colombia, all over the U.S., Italy, Sicily, and Europe, and so forth. Do you feel that there's still a price on your head to this day or no?
No, I don't. No, the relationships I had with a lot of these people, I remember there's a famous attorney in New York City. His name is Jerry Lefcourt. When the Sicilians were on trial in Philadelphia, they brought him down just to cross-examine me. They paid him $30,000 just to cross-examine me. And he tried to say, well, it was a brotherly relationship between you and the Sicilians. I says, I wouldn't call it a brotherly relationship when I give them $1 million, And this was the magnitude of it. But all the other people, like they sent me out to Detroit to the Giacalone family, okay? And I infiltrated the Giacalone family out in Detroit. And the guy that I was dealing with was their enforcer, Bobby LaPuma, who was a killer. And, I walked away from that case, and I didn't feel that there'd be any retribution against me or anything like that. And a number of the other cases, I went up to Canada and worked on the Catroni family. And again, I didn't have any feeling that they would come after me. No, so I would say I've been lucky, and I still look in my rearview mirror, when I get in the car. But that's what I've always done. But no, I don't think, they'll want to do anything to an 81-year-old geezer. So.
Well, Frank Panessa, I appreciate you coming in and sharing your story. People have different views when it comes to drugs. Here we are, 2022, marijuana is legal in most states, and It used to be a drug that people got locked up for. Now Biden is actually pardoning some of the people who have been in prison for marijuana charges. But I think what you were doing in particular, in terms of stopping the heroin trade, I don't think too many people would have a problem with that, because ultimately heroin is a terrible drug that has horrific results in multi-generational situations.
It still does.
It still does. Cocaine, depends on how you look at it. Some people are for it, some people are against it. I don't see cocaine ever being legalized, but heroin is one of those things that I've heard absolute horror stories. So I personally have no problem with someone like yourself shutting down operations like this and ultimately saving lives in the long term. So I appreciate you coming in, sharing your story, and wish you all the best.
Well, it was great talking to you, Vlad.
You as well. Peace.
Take care.